Okay, good day or evening, everybody. My name is Ermias Kabrap. I am the director of the World Food Center, Associate Dean of Global Engagements, and a Professor of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis. Today, we are presenting the second in a series of independent dialogues as a precursor to the United Nations Food System Summit in September of this year. And today's dialogue targets track one, which focuses on ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. And today's dialogue is titled Innovations in Food Fortification and Supplementation. And thank you to our facilitator, panelists, and other invited experts for being with us today. And thank you also to those of you watching the recording of this dialogue. The format of today's events is as follows. The facilitator will give an overview of the topic, then introduce the panelists. And each panelist will give a brief presentation. And after the presentations, then we'll have a moderated dialogue amongst all participants and panelists. We are looking for expert dialogue around six areas mainly. One is to provide sectoral context for the particular innovations under examination, why these innovations are important, what other themes or innovations in this action track are also important. Second is to encourage discussion of potential gaps in science and evidence base that warrant continuing research. And third area is to encourage discussion on the potential of these innovations to deliver food system solutions, whether they might even be considered game changers. Fourth is to identify potential areas of divergence or debate among the experts or participants. Fifth is to memorialize common perspective and themes. And finally, foster expert consensus on next steps and new directions. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. The invited guest microphones are muted for now. We will unmute you after the presentations end. Please turn off your video for the first part of the event. And please hold your questions until the discussion period. And please use the raised hand feature in your toolbar to be addressed. If you have any issues, please send a chat to the host and you will get targeted help. The video recording will be available in a few weeks on the World Food Center website, and we'll send a link to that as well. Now I'd like to introduce the facilitator of today's dialogue, Dr. Gerald or Jerry Shively. Jerry Shively is Associate Dean and Director of International Programs in the College of Agriculture at Purdue University. He is an applied economist with more than 2 decades of experience working worldwide in the areas of agricultural development, food security, and human nutrition. Thank you for agreeing to facilitate the discussion today, and I will pass it on to you and leave it in your capable hands. Dr. Shively.
Great, okay, thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thank you for that warm welcome. And I'd like to extend the welcome to the entire panel and all of our distinguished scientists and global thought leaders who have joined us, either live during the event or on the recording. I'm especially pleased to be here today to help facilitate today's presentations and discussions on the topic of innovations in food fortification and supplementation. I'd like to thank Ermias and the UC Davis organizers for inviting me. This series of events organized by UC Davis focusing on food systems directly complements a year-long series of virtual events that we've been organizing at Purdue on the topic of agricultural innovations for small family farms. Those events, like these, are being supported by USDA. And I'd like to reiterate my thanks to USDA for being at the forefront of efforts to support the SDG of ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. Before I turn to the panelists, I just wanted to open with a thought. Several years ago, as part of my own research supported by USAID via the Innovation Lab for Nutrition that's was housed at Tufts University, my research team undertook some analysis to understand better the patterns of linear growth among children living in Nepal. And we approached this in several different ways, but one of the things that we did was attempted to explain the sources of variation observed in HAZ scores. And we did this using several rounds of the DHS data, decomposing the variation that we observed into portions that arise at the child level, at the household level, at the community, and even at the district level. And what we learned, not surprisingly, is that factors operating at all of these levels contribute in very important ways to patterns of linear growth in young children. And consistent with studies of maternal and child health, such as those reviewed in the Lancet series, there's no single silver bullet to improving nutrition outcomes. Actions and interventions at all levels are important. At the same time, our research suggested that the relative importance of interventions does matter, with about half of the total variation in explanatory power surrounding linear growth in children arising at the level of the child directly. About a quarter of it could be explained at the household level, and another quarter at sort of the community or district level. And that kind of 50, 25, 25 rule of thumb has stuck with me. Importantly, the large share and the large importance of explanatory power at the level of the individual. And I think that underscores the importance of the topic today, all of which are interventions that are designed to reach people most directly where their nutrition needs are the greatest. So with that little preamble, I'd like to welcome all of our participants, and I'll introduce all of the panelists to begin, and then I'll turn it over to our first panelist. So joining us today is Rob Bertram, who's the Chief Scientist at USAID's Bureau of Food Security. Rob serves as the key advisor on a range of technical and program issues to advance global food security and nutrition. In this role, Dr. Bertram leads USAID's evidence-based efforts to advance research, technology, and implementation in support of US government global hunger and food security, the initiative Feed the Future. Dr. Bertram's academic background is in plant breeding and genetics and includes degrees from the University of California, Davis, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Maryland. Second is Seth Adu-Arfa, the senior lecturer in the Department of Nutrition and Food Science at the University of Ghana. Dr. Adu-Arfa has been a collaborator for more than 12 years in USAID supported research involving small quantity LNS supplementation, which we'll be hearing about shortly, and more recently, bouillon cube fortification, also a subject for today's discussion. Christine Stewart is the Corinne L. Rustica Endowed Chair in Applied Human Nutrition and Director of the Institute for Global Nutrition at UC Davis. Her expertise is in maternal and child nutrition. Dr. Stewart's research focuses on evaluating the impacts of micronutrient-rich foods or supplements on improving child health, growth, and development in low-income communities. Third of our panelists is Raina Engel-Stone, Assistant Professor in the Department of Nutrition and faculty with the Institute for Global Nutrition at UC Davis. Dr. Engel-Stone's research aims to improve nutrition among vulnerable populations globally, with specific focus on micronutrient nutrition, food fortification, dietary analysis, and modeling. And finally, Stephen Vosti is adjunct professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California, Davis, where he teaches classes on the economics of human nutrition and on the economics of small-scale agriculture in developing countries. Dr. Vosti currently leads a team comprised of nutritionists, geographers, biostatisticians, economists, and policy engagement specialists that develops and uses tools to help developing countries design and manage more cost-effective micronutrient intervention programs and policies. And I think when we get to the discussion and we begin to enter into a conversation about policy, Steve's insights are going to be especially pertinent. So with that, I'll now turn it over to our first panelist, Following brief presentations by everyone, we'll open it up to discussion and questions. I look forward to the presentations, and I look forward to a lively and spirited and open discussion to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry and Dr. Cabrera, for inviting me to join today. It's great to be part of this event. And I know thinking about both UC Davis and Purdue universities, both of these universities have met the challenge of global food security by dedicating specific centers to lead thinking in this space. So we're very grateful for that leadership, that thought leadership that emanates from both institutions, and very pleased to be a part of this today. So why are we here? I think basically because the scourge of micronutrient malnutrition, and it is a scourge, is still very much with us. Sometimes it's called hidden hunger because it's not quite as evident. But if we look deeply, we know that the evidence for its very negative impacts on human growth and development and potential are critical. When we started Feed the Future over 10 years ago, we mapped extreme poverty, we mapped child stunting, which were our top line objectives, and areas with agricultural potential. And of course, that's also where the poverty and undernutrition concentrated. What we found was that same map correlated with maps of vitamin A deficiency, with maps of iron deficiency anemia. So in a sense, what we found is that micronutrient malnutrition, which is estimated to affect, 2 billion people, it is highly aligned with where we're trying to work on hunger and extreme poverty. So it's an essential part of the picture, and it's basically a marker for poor diet quality. And there are other factors that can affect it, of course, sanitation and clean water being a critical one, but and cares. But diet quality is a huge part of what we can offer in the food and agriculture community. So at USAID, we think about multiple entry points, nutrient-rich foods. So for example, we've worked with UC Davis, the Horticulture Innovation Lab, very long-standing efforts. Animal source foods, we think of Lindsay Allen's work, also connected with Davis and USDA's Western Nutrition Center, showing that low levels of dietary intake of animal source foods is so highly correlated with B12 deficiency. Biofortification is another tool in our tool chest. Food safety, another thing that can assist us. And there's a place where we're working very actively with Purdue University to improve food safety, but also fortification. And there's a long storied history, and that's what we're here to talk about today. There's a long storied history involving USDA, USAID, and US universities. We have a long track record going back 50 years, things around, say, vitamin A fortification of sugar, of vegetable oil, multiple nutrient flour fortification, and of course, perhaps most famously, iodized salt. In certain contexts, these have been game changers. But fortification, when agriculture fell off the map in the 1990s, nutrition sort of migrated to health globally, but certainly in USAID as well. And fortification became a main focus, along with supplementation, especially in emergency situations, to address micronutrient malnutrition. And there used to be a micronutrient earmark. Then we had the Copenhagen Consensus in the early part of this century, which said that the #1 development investment would be food fortification. #1 above all else. And the Gates Foundation, I think, when they stepped into food and agriculture 15 years ago or so, food fortification became a focus there as well. But frankly, visibility of food fortification in the last 10 years or so, or 15 years in USAID, has somewhat diminished. perhaps inadvertently, because we were emphasizing the importance of food to nutrition, which is very, very fundamental, and which frankly had been diminished in earlier years. And one of the great things about Feed the Future was it brought food and agriculture back together. But now I think what we're seeing is that it's time to focus again on fortification. And we know the whole world's talking about food systems, right? And we have the Food Systems Summit, as Dr. Cabrera referred to. We have the Nutrition for Growth coming this year also. Food systems, while everybody's talking about them, they are a compelling concept, but a complex construct. And yet this is one of the pathways in food systems, fortification that is really clear and focused, and we know where it will go. So this is, unlike many aspects of food systems, which are very diffuse, food fortification, especially at the industrial level, I mean, at broad scale, is a proven tool, and one that we think at USAID, we think it's time to bring sharply back in focus. Micronutrient dense foods remain out of reach, fruits and vegetables, and especially animal source foods, for many poor people. And we are trying to increase the productivity and affordability of fruits and vegetables and dairy and fish and eggs, et cetera, for income, and it's also to make those foods more available. But they still remain relatively expensive, far more in the developed world, where an egg can cost 15 times what its same weight of cereal would cost compared to Europe or North America or other developed regions. So fortification is a sort of a safety net. And it's also especially important during shocks, because we know if there is a shock to income, people shift out of expensive, diverse foods and back into relatively inexpensive staples. So fortification and biofortification makes sense. And these are all sort of arrows in the quiver of trying to improve nutrition. And we know the other thing that drives our interest in fortification now is we know that food is more purchased, more processed than ever before. And this is true even of poor people in the developing world. We increasingly see people purchase more of their food. So this safety net is actually widening if we use it right, because more people are purchasing things. So we know how to do this at broad scale, but that doesn't mean we can't do better. And that's what today's talks are going to be about. Hearing about innovations, about new ways of targeting nutrients to the poor, to the vulnerable, to individuals who need them through innovative approaches. So it's really about upping our game, becoming more focused, more targeted, and more effective. And I think we've got examples. We're going to hear about the lipid supplements, fortified infant cereals. We won't be talking about today, but that's another example where we see both great opportunity but challenges with respect to aflatoxin. So the other last point I want to make is, to make this work, it's got to be a public-private partnership. Yes, there's a government role, there's a policy role, but we need industry, the food producers and processors to be with us. And that's another reason that it's so appropriate in a food systems context to be addressing this topic. So thank you very much for letting me start us off along with Jerry. I look forward to the speakers and to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
I'm just going to turn it directly over to Christine Stewart. Dr. Stewart's going to tell us about lipid-based nutrient supplementation and her research in that area.
So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today. So I will be speaking about small quantity lipid-based nutrient supplements, which are a form of supplementation or targeted home fortification. And I'll be presenting evidence of impacts and then concluding with a few thoughts and questions about considerations for scaling up. And this, I hope, will simulate some of the conversation in the second hour of this gathering. So most of you on this call are well aware that meeting nutrient requirements for young children can be quite challenging. And unfortunately, in many low-income environments, the dietary quality and diversity of foods offered to children 6 to 24 months of age is inadequate. Now, there's a number of approaches that can be used to address nutrient gaps. Education and behavior change programs are one approach to encourage dietary diversity or inclusion of nutrient-dense animal source foods or vitamin A-rich fruits and vegetables into the diet. And generally, these intervention programs have been successful at improving dietary diversity, but there's limited evidence of impacts on growth or development. Now, large-scale food fortification, as has been mentioned, is another approach, and it focuses on improving the micronutrient density of staple foods or commonly consumed condiments. And it's very successful at the population level, and I think some of the next speakers will talk to that in more detail. But those programs are not specifically targeted to the nutrient requirements of 6 to 24-month-old children and their unique needs. So to specifically target young children, home fortification is another approach. Multiple micronutrient powders are an example that have been around for many years. And then in addition to that, small quantity lipid-based nutrient supplements have been studied in research context over the past 10 years or so. And they contain both macro and micronutrients and may be blended into a child's meal, or they may be fed directly from the packet. And both of these approaches improve micronutrient density of the diets of young children. Now, lipid-based nutrient supplements are part of a family of products that range from small quantity supplements on the left, which are intended for prevention, to medium and large quantity supplements that are more commonly used for the treatment of moderate or severe malnutrition. And we're focused on today's discussion on the small quantity LNS. These are provided in small sachets of 10 to 20 grams, providing between 60 to 120 calories typically, and they may be offered once or twice per day. The quantity is intended to be small enough to incorporate into a young child's diet without displacing breast milk intake. And they provide a comprehensive array of micronutrients in doses of approximately 1 RDA for children in this age range. Now, to date, at least 20 trials have been conducted evaluating the impacts of small quantity LNS. There were 3 from Asia, 15 from Africa, 1 from the Caribbean, and 1 from Latin America. And so we have a strong evidence base from which to examine the impacts of LNS across contexts and environments. And our group has been conducting a series of meta-analyses and pooled analyses using individual participant data aggregated across most of these studies shown here. And I'll briefly present those results and then offer some thoughts about where we might go from here. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to be presenting the details of the methods of the meta-analysis, but I could discuss that later with anyone who might be interested. So jumping right to the results that we've found, and this first slide was published published from a paper back in 2019. This is the results of the impacts of LNS on child mortality. And when aggregated across all of the trials, we found that there was a significant 27% reduction in all-cause mortality among children 6 to 24 months of age. And turning to growth, we can also see that there were significant reductions in the prevalence of adverse outcomes in the LNS group compared to the control group across trials. For example, you can see here that there was about a 12 to 14% reduction in stunting and wasting. And with respect to child development, we examined the probability of children falling in the lowest decile of developmental scores. And again, you can see there was a reduction in the probability of children falling in this lowest decile for language, socio-emotional, and motor development, although there were no effects on executive function. Looking at the micronutrient biomarkers and anemia. The prevalence of anemia was about 16% lower, while moderate to severe anemia we found to be about 28% lower prevalence. And iron deficiency were more than cut in half. So in summary, we're finding that small quantity LNS significantly reduces a number of adverse outcomes in children. There were statistically significant reductions in mortality, stunting, wasting, underweight, acute malnutrition, and small head size. And there were also significant reductions in the prevalence of children scoring in the lowest decile of developmental assessments. And there were significant reductions in anemia and iron deficiency. So because LNS has benefits on all of these outcomes, it can help us to achieve our global goals, specifically SDG2 and SDG3. Moreover, it can support all three pillars of the UN Global Strategy for women's, children's, and adolescents' health: surviving, ending preventable deaths; thriving, ensuring health and well-being; and transforming and expanding enabling environments. But that's really only if it can be delivered at scale. So how would we get there? So I'm showing the MSI International Scaling Up Framework just as a model roadmap illustrating the process to go from innovation to delivery at scale. To start with a vision, assess scalability, and fill information gaps on the left, all the way to implementation and quality assurance on the right. And with SQLNS, I think we're really here at step one. So I'd like to dive in a bit to some of the questions and work that needs to be done to accomplish these tasks in a bit more detail. So the MSI framework provides a series of questions to assess the situation and determine if the necessary conditions exist to take an innovation to scale. For example, do stakeholders and intended beneficiaries perceive a need for this? Has the intervention been documented, including evidence of efficacy, effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and process? Does the evidence suggest that this is better than other approaches? Is the cost feasible for the implementing organizations? And are there obvious economies of scale? How can institutional characteristics that were key to the outcomes achieved in the RCTs be replicated or enlarged? Is there anything unique about the social or political context or circumstances of the environments in which the RCTs were conducted that would need to be present for the intervention to be successful at broader scale? And are there countries or governments or organizations that are interested in adopting the intervention? So with LNS, I think we have evidence to answer some of these questions, but not all of them. And then additionally, another step is to determine what evidence is needed to make decisions. And this is where I think we as a research and implementation community can also have an impact. So the types of evidence, for instance, from systematic reviews and meta-analyses or effectiveness studies, cost effectiveness estimates, or comparative effectiveness studies or modeling studies to compare impacts of this newer intervention to other types of programmatic alternatives, and evidence of processes necessary to achieve success. And with the work that has been done so far, we have good evidence from systematic reviews and meta-analyses. We have effectiveness studies from large demonstration projects, and work is underway to estimate cost effectiveness. So where should we be going? How can we influence the next steps? What additional evidence gaps must be filled to facilitate adoption by implementing agencies? And what are the major barriers to larger scale adoption? How should SQLNS be considered in the mix of other types of investments, such as foods or food systems, supplementation, fortification, and behavior change interventions? And how can we build a constituency to advocate for scaling? So I present these as some questions for discussion that I'm hoping that we can have in the second half. I'm sure also that Seth, Steve, and others will have some further thoughts and considerations. So I look forward to the discussion. And I'll finish by acknowledging our funders for this work, primarily the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which supported this meta-analysis. And I'd also like to acknowledge that federal funding has been used to support many of the trials presented in this talk, including USAID, USDA, and NIH, as well as from many other organizations. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the researchers that have contributed data from their trials and participated in the IPD analysis, but especially Kay Dewey, Ryan Wessels, Charles Arnold, and Beth Prado. And I will finish there.
Christine, that was really fascinating, and it raises all kinds of questions and provokes all kinds of thought that I'd like to jump into right away. But we've agreed that we'll hold all of that discussion until all the panelists have spoken. So we'll hold our thoughts and we'll come back in a little while. Our next presenter is Raina Engel-Stone, who's going to be telling us more about her work on micronutrient fortification using bouillon cubes. Raina, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk with everyone today about fortification of bouillon cubes and the potential for this strategy to help increase the nutrient adequacy of diets. So we've already heard from the really nice introduction, the background on how large-scale fortification programs, mostly of staples, but also salt, have been scaled up in recent decades or 100 years, if you think about salt, to increase nutrient adequacy of diets and address micronutrient deficiencies and the consequences. But there have also been challenges, and in particular, some foods that have been selected for fortification may not reach the entire population that's at risk for deficiency, or may not reach that population in a form that's easily fortifiable. And many face implementation challenges as well. And so there's a continued need to search for new strategies. And other condiments are often widely consumed, suggesting that these would be good vehicles potentially for micronutrient fortification. And you can see here there was a consultation with WHO that looked a little bit at this several years ago. And bouillon in particular is consumed very widely in West Africa, as well as a few other parts of the world. Depending on the country, it could be 75 to 95% of households that consume bouillon regularly. So very few foods are consumed that widely other than perhaps salt. And there is some voluntary fortification of bouillon cubes on the market, but there's been relatively little attention to the use of these as a fortification vehicle for a public health program. And we know in general that fortification programs tend to be efficacious or have the potential to be, but again, there's not that evidence base yet for bouillon. So thinking about what sort of evidence gaps might need to be filled in the case of any new food vehicle, but in this case, bouillon, some of the questions that need to be answered are first, which micronutrients are possible to add in which fortificant forms, and then in what amounts. So in the case of bouillon, the amount of premix affects the structure of the cube and how it crumbles, in addition to potentially having effects on sensory properties like taste or smell. Other questions are which micronutrients are needed and in what amounts to actually meet the public health goals. So what are the deficiencies that might be present in a given context, and what would be needed to fill that gap. And these discussions need to also consider how much variation there might be among countries and also within countries in intakes. And then finally, how do we balance deficiencies with the potential for high intakes, especially in contexts where there are already other foods that are fortified. And then another piece of evidence is whether this strategy is effective for not just for increasing micronutrients in the diet, but for improving micronutrient status and then related health outcomes. And then of course, the questions about what will this cost in practice? How does the cost effectiveness compare with other strategies? Who might pay those costs, we may come back to, and then how will regulations work, how will monitoring be done? And then also how did the intervention maybe coexist with other priorities for nutrition and health? And particularly for bouillon, the question is, how does this coexist with efforts to reduce sodium? So what I will do is focus on some of the work that we have done or are in the process of doing to answer some of these questions about contribution to diets and then to status. So to answer this first question of what can fortification of this vehicle potentially contribute to diets and what amounts of micronutrients might fill dietary gaps, we can use analysis and modeling of national survey data on dietary intake. So in this example, I'll show you individual level dietary data from Cameroon. And then we've also relied on household consumption and expenditure survey data, which are household level data on food acquisition or consumption that can then be used to examine the nutrient adequacy of household food consumption in, again, Cameroon, but as well as Ghana and Haiti. So this is an example of the types of results that can be derived by this analysis, just using folate as an example. And we've done this for other micronutrients as well. So on the y-axis here, we're looking at the prevalence of inadequate intake. And on the x-axis, this is looking at different amounts of folic acid added to bouillon cube. And these different lines are different target groups and then within different surveys. So we can see that across these different settings, without any fortification of bouillon, we're looking at a prevalence of dietary inadequacy between 20 to maybe 65%. And then at these modeled levels, we would expect that that could be reduced across all of these groups to below 30% at these levels of folic acid in bouillon. So this suggests that this could be a way to contribute to reducing inadequate intakes. But we also need to consider the other side of the distribution and make sure that we're not contributing to high intakes either. And so we're also looking at prevalence of intakes above the tolerable upper intake level. And as you see in this example, we do see some groups starting to exceed that threshold but just at the highest levels that were modeled. So that's looking at bouillon alone, and then it's maybe even more instructive to look at bouillon in the context of all the other foods that could potentially be fortified and are fortified in some countries. So in this example, this is looking at vitamin A intake and prevalence of inadequacy among children in Haiti in different modeled scenarios that assume that different types of food vehicles are fortified and then combinations of those. So I think the first thing that's really striking is that prevalence of inadequacy is very high in the absence of fortification, and that with different vehicles fortified, we could theoretically essentially eliminate inadequate intakes. But as you also see with these blue plus signs, the prevalence of high vitamin A intakes also starts to creep up. And so using this approach, a number of scenarios can be examined to shed some light on what combinations of foods and then what levels might be selected. And then in addition to the modeling, it's important to confirm evidence of impact on micronutrient status and other outcomes. And so randomized trials are the primary evidence that's used by WHO in setting guidelines for different interventions. And these don't exist for bouillon yet. So no forest plots or any related evidence for bouillon. So our group is planning to start to fill this gap with a trial that will be conducted in northern Ghana, so with Seth and the excellent team at University of Ghana. And the general design will be to provide a multi-micronutrient fortified bouillon cubes compared to a control cube to households, and then look at some of the impacts on micronutrient status, dietary intake, and health among these vulnerable groups within the household that tend to be vulnerable to micronutrient deficiencies. We look forward to sharing results from this in the future. And this is just to note that this work, the clinical trial and then the modeling work is that's currently being done is in coordination with technical work and regulatory work that are being conducted by other organizations to address some of these other evidence gaps and then link that evidence with ongoing policy discussions at the same time. And so this bigger initiative is currently funded by the Gates Foundation. And so it's really a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder initiative, which brings its challenges, but the advantage is that the evidence and then the policy discussions are really linked from the beginning. So just to summarize in terms of what might be next for bouillon fortification, I think given how widely it's consumed, over 90% of households in some countries, it really is an opportunity to address micronutrient deficiencies that are still remaining despite these other programs. And there's not that much evidence yet, but that's changing with some of the modeling work, at least this trial that's planned, and then ongoing work to address some of these other technical challenges. And Steve will talk more about the costing. And then finally, I think another point we can discuss later is the linking of this evidence generation with channels for disseminating that. So I'll just acknowledge very briefly, this is the current bouillon team. And then I also want to acknowledge, we've worked with HKI Cameroon for a long time on this modeling, and then Partners of the Americas in Gain in Haiti as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Raina. Really interesting, and a great transition segue to Seth's presentation. I think Seth will be talking about the experience in Ghana with collaborative research and engagement with both the LNS and the bouillon products. Seth, over to you.
So the purpose of my presentation is just to make a few remarks about the collaborative work we are doing with faculty at UC Davis, and then also to say a few things about the work we are doing with LNS and Bouillon Cube in the context of policy in Ghana, and how the work fits into the policy agenda in Ghana. Here I'm showing, or I want to emphasize 3 policy documents that are relevant to the work we are doing with small quantity lipid-based nutrient supplements and bouillon fortification. I know that there are a lot of government policies in Ghana, each of them seeking to do one thing or another with nutrition. But for the work that we are doing with LNS and Bouillon Cube, these 3 are very relevant, and we keep our eyes on them and see how the work fits into these policies. The first is the National Nutrition Policy, the one that coordinates all the nutrition activities in Ghana. It has 3 goals. One of them is to increase the coverage of high impact nutrition sensitive interventions, specifically to enhance the intake of micronutrients by infants and young children through several strategies, including food fortification, home fortification, and micronutrient supplementation. So obviously we see that what we are doing with LNS and Bouillon fits very much into this policy. The other policy that I want to mention is the one on anemia control, the one that also talks about iron supplementation, food fortification, with a view to improving iron intake so as to address the high prevalence of anemia in Ghana. And then the third one is the one that was a strategy document that the Ghana Health Service developed several years ago, and it also specifically mentions micronutrient supplementation and food fortification. What the point I'm making here is that, I mean, in some countries, sometimes people don't have policies, or often the policies are not enough to generate the kind of impetus necessary for addressing specific issues. But I think we have in Ghana a lot of policies, and these three, I think, generate enough of the momentum, enough of the policy framework needed to move forward with what you have found with LNS and what you are going to be doing with Bouillon Cube. Okay. Now, in terms of the government agencies that are involved in policy development, there are 3 that I have listed here that I think going forward with the work we are doing, we need to work collaboratively with them, go into direct interactions with them, and so then they know what you are doing The first one is what you call the National Development Planning Commission, I think established in the 1990s. And their main job is to, well, they are the government agency mandated to develop policies and ensure that all policies and strategies developed in the country are implemented well. Ghana Health Service, as far as nutrition is concerned, they are the national agency that deals with implementing all the policies that are related to health delivery. They also make their own strategies and policies. And then finally, we have the Food and Drugs Authority, the agency that is involved, that has the mandate to provide and enforce standards regarding sales of foods and medicines and supplements and all, and all the things related to, say, bouillon cube or LNS. Sorry. And so moving forward, we need to keep our eyes on these government agencies, knowing that policy is one of the major ingredients for moving forward with what you have found with LNS and bouillon cube, what you are going to be finding with bouillon cube, in terms of moving those forward and letting them help in transforming our food system. So going, summarizing the political, the policy environment and what we have here in terms of moving forward with the knowledge that we have from LNS and bouillon, we obviously there are many policies, and so the environment, the policy environment is quite favorable in terms of moving forward with things about supplementation and fortification. I think one of the things that we should be doing is to be at the conduit between research findings and policymakers, help them to understand what they are finding, communicate with them in ways that they will understand. Right now, there is a lot of dialogue going on with respect to Ghana's food systems. I am, with the work that I've done and I've been doing with LNS, I'm able to participate in that discussion. Track one that deals with production of safe and nutritious foods for all, and then the other part that deals with integrating nutrition into health care. I hope that you will have more communication interaction with the policymakers and eventually be able to get people's support for LNS and bouillon cube. Then in terms of the collaborative work with UC Davis, a lot has been said about Ireland's LNS study already, so I don't want to, I don't need to say so much here right now, but the work about adding macronutrients to the staples or the food prepared foods and enriching those things, adding essential fatty acids to foods. I think the work that you have done with LNS in Ghana has been most rewarding, and it is now the time to see how we can make use of the data that we have, the knowledge that we have acquired from that research. This slide talks about trying to show the macronutrient contents of the lipid-based nutrient supplements that were given to children and their mothers and their children. The last two columns, just to show that the standard supplementation for women is simply doesn't seem to be enough in trying to meet the requirements for all the nutrients, the macronutrients that are needed during pregnancy and lactation. And so it makes pretty good sense that at some point the provision of more macronutrients might become more beneficial than just iron and folic acid. Just a little bit about the LNS study. We started in 2009 and finished the first randomized trial in 2014. And then we did our the first follow-up study at the time when the children whose mothers were enrolled in the randomized trial, at the time the children were 6 years, between 4 and 6 years of age, between 2016 and 2017. And then recently, last year, we started the second follow-up. And at this time, the children are between the ages of 10, around 10, 11, and 12. And then we have also started the bouillon cube. I think it is promising. Bouillon is consumed, nearly every home in Ghana. I think the promise about bouillon is that the national fortification hasn't achieved as much as it was thought to be able to achieve, because flour doesn't get to all the homes in ways that bouillon could get. So it might be more interesting. I think it's promising to be able to fortify bouillon and try to reach as many people in the most remote places as possible. In terms of the collaborative research we had with UC Davis, has been very rewarding. We've learned a lot in terms of research design, data collection and analysis. In terms of capacity building and training students, we have more than 5 PhDs, I think. And then through the research, we have a strong cadre of data collectors. It's incredible the work that we've done in getting the people together in ways that we are able to collect pretty good data, and I think it's interesting. And so moving forward, I think it tells about what we can do if we go along the way we have started. And I should mention that recently, University of Ghana has been enlisted as a local site, and I hope that we will see more of an exchange of students between Ghana and the US, and I think it will go a long way to build more capacity in our country. We have tried to, here I'm trying to show some of the past interactions that we have tried to have with the people who make policies at the national and sectoral levels through the dissemination of our findings. We have had 2 dissemination of findings from the LNS study. And then we also did a similar one to launch the comments, the bouillon cube study. During these interactions, we invited people from the ministry, from various international and organizations, UN organizations, academic SAN movement, and all the people who are essential for policy development and policy and programs. And we thought that was one of the ways which we could interact with policymakers. And going forward, we will do more. We will try to do more of those things and get them involved with the research we are doing. So then it will be much easier to incorporate the findings into policy as we move along. As a summary, I think what we need to do now is to be able to create more awareness of the research that we are doing. I think the LNS study, we have collected a lot of data. We are going to be also working on the bouillon. A lot of data will be collected. A lot of knowledge will be obtained, and our job is to create more awareness of the knowledge that we get. One of the things that we should also be doing is to clarify the linkage. At this level, the policymakers, the politicians, the people who make the policies and implement programs. I think our job as researchers one of the things you should do is to clarify the linkage between nutrition and food systems, particularly at this time when the food systems dialogue is going on, and also finding ways to disseminate, communicate research findings in ways that they will, people who make policies will understand and use the knowledge that we gather. So this is just to reiterate the collaboration that you have had with UC Davis, and also to acknowledge the role of all the people and the institutions that are involved in the collaboration, UC Davis, Tampere University, and NutriSet, and Malawi, and the group in Burkina Faso, and all those who have helped move our collaboration forward. It's been nice working with them up to this point. I think this is the end of the slide.
Seth, thank you so much for that really interesting and on sort of boots on the ground assessment of, in particular, the government role. I was struck by, the number of government actors that you need to get in the boat, and then you have to figure out how to get them all rowing in the same direction. And I appreciate the challenge there. The thing that I think I was wondering about, and we'll return to this in the discussion, is to connect it back to Rob Bertram's comments and the role of the private sector. So there was a lot of discussion of the government sector, government actors, getting the policy framework right. But I'd like, when we come back to the discussion, to kind of probe more deeply what the potential role for the private sector would be in Ghana. So I think that's a very nice segue to Steve Vosti's presentation, which will be the next and last one. Steve's going to talk about economic and policy issues and their implications for these supplementation and biofortification fortification programs. So Stephen, the microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk, I'm following up on really bits and pieces that others have begun earlier this morning, but I want to take a particular look at the economics and policy issues associated with some of these programs that either have already been developed and we're kind of in the promotional stage, or we're still in the development stage. And my point of departure always is, what exactly do policymakers need to know in order to begin to discuss and take decisions on this? Well, first is, what are the micronutrient problems nationally and subnationally? And you might be surprised that, while we can say generally that there's huge problems, often we don't know as much as we would like to know or need to know about these. But more particularly, what are the consequences of these? And for policy discussions, how do we cast these things in ways that policymakers can understand and they can sell to constituencies? And that's a real challenge that we face. The next is, well, hold on, aren't we already doing something in essentially every country? Don't we have some programs in place? So what are these? What are these programs? Oh, by the way, how much are we spending on them? How well are they performing? And what impacts are they having? The next question is, well, okay, what else can be done? We know we're doing 2 or 3 things. Might we do other things? And this is where the innovation comes in, new products or additions to existing products. What other programs exist? How effective would they be? And what are the costs associated with these different programs? And by the way, we cannot do everything everywhere forever. We don't have the money, we don't have the personnel, we don't have the time, and we don't have the political support. So how do we go about helping developing country partners establish priorities? Now, the innovations I want to talk about are on the tool development side. It is our job to develop the empirical bases and the analytical tools to help answer some of these questions, because these are all showstoppers. If we can't answer all of these, then often discussions are just grind to a halt. We have developed such a tool, the Minimod tool, micronutrient intervention modeling tool, that takes as its point of departure dietary intake from different sources, assesses what people are actually eating, identifies a proportion of these populations that are deficient or have inadequate intake, and then begins to experiment with improving the quality of these diets with one or more of these micronutrient intervention programs. Alongside that, so this is the nutritional status and benefits model. Alongside of that, we do the cost modeling, because nothing is free. Everything costs money to plan, to establish, and to operate. And we need to know what these costs are, and in particular, who's going to be called upon to pay them. Once you have these, this type of information, both for the existing programs and for the programs that hypothetically could be undertaken in your country, then you simply do the simple math, which is what is the relative cost effectiveness of these alternative interventions, some of which we may be doing already, others which we could invest in. And then the final part of the mini-mod tool is an economic optimization model, which actually looks over all different possible interventions over space and time and gives you the most cost-effective strategy and how it differs from what, for example, a business as usual strategy might be. So I'm going to use part of these tools now to kind of zero in on a couple of key policy questions and situations. This is the situation as it exists right now in Nigeria in terms of food fortification. You have a collection of mandatory fortification programs, and here are the details associated with them. And here are kind of some indicators of the extent to which these are performing as we would hope. There are a whole bunch of voluntary programs out there about which we know practically nothing, to be absolutely honest. And we'll get back to why that is the case, hopefully in the discussion. And then finally, there are, as Raina pointed out, a whole bunch of different hypothetical interventions, one of which is bouillon cube. I want to focus on these two and put the kind of model, the parts of the mini model to the test in answering some of the core questions that policymakers ask. So first, I'm going to focus, and I'll focus only on this particular, this beneficiary group, children 6 to 59 months of age, and vitamin A. We can do this for any micronutrient and essentially for any group that you'd like to look at in the population. So question number one, what are the diets providing? And these are estimates of inadequate intake nationally and subnationally based on dietary intakes. If you include the mandatory fortification programs, then actually you're making a dent. And the dent in some areas is much more significant than others. And you can use the tool then to say, okay, well, what if we did other things? Say we did only bouillon cube at level 1 fortification, or if we did bouillon cubes at level 2, or we started combining these different interventions. And what you can see, and this is something we already know, is that different combinations of these fortification programs in certain areas can go a long way, perhaps all the way, to addressing public health questions or problems around micronutrient deficiencies. But that's one side of it. The flip side is, well, how much is this going to cost? And what we have is, these are the estimates for the cost for individual effectively covered. And this is the proportion of the population that in a sense graduates from inadequate intake to adequate intake thanks to one or more of the interventions. And this is the bouillon cube intervention at 2 levels of fortification. And what you can see is that for some of these micronutrients, it's relatively expensive to effectively cover an individual. In the case of iron, because of absorption issues. In the case of vitamin A, because of the deterioration of vitamin A in the bouillon cube, and therefore the overage that has to be included. For some of these others, it's a very cheap way to solve a problem by that definition. Now, let me step back and talk about processes. In the past, if we're having to decide on the amounts or types of micronutrients to be added to particular products or products added to the arsenal, we usually went to nutritionists, and they sat and looked at nutrient needs, the intervention efficacy. They need to know something about deficiencies, the extent to which these deficiencies had to do with inadequate intake, and then they would incorporate into their analysis other issues, infection rates, and things like that that would influence the absorbability. And of some of these micronutrients and learn something about dietary intake, and then decide, how much of what different micronutrients would be included in different food vehicles. We're learning through our work in the micronutrient fortification of bouillon cubes that it probably shouldn't be a kind of a single stakeholder type of conversation. It needs to be multiple stakeholders. And the second group of stakeholders is going to be the folks who actually are going to have to pay the cost for these. And so people need to know what the cost of these different programs should be, and remembering that even small costs can be very important. And we'll get back to that later. Who's going to be paying these costs? What options exist for cost sharing? And specifically, what is the process that's going to be in place to discuss, decide, and enforce these issues associated with costing? On the technical side, and Reina pointed this out, not everything that we can dream of is actually doable. Technically, some of these things require majorly behavioral changes that may not come about. And we need to know something about the willingness of consumers to accept and pay for these new innovations. And finally, but very importantly, regulatory capacity looms large among national production and imported products as well. And so what we're finding is that, what nutritionists would ideally like to see in these products often is questions and need to be adjusted based on the input from these other stakeholders that are quite influential and quite important in not only deciding what to do, but making sure that it gets done. My penultimate slide here, and this gets back to Rob's question of, well, the arrow and the quiver. It's generally assumed that once you pull out your arrow, you shoot it, you hit the bullseye, and then you can just walk away. And we have learned, and we continue to learn, that that's not the case, even for the apparently most simple programs. This is, again, the Minimod tool put to work to estimate the number of cases of anemia averted, given different levels of fortification of wheat flour. And you can see that it varies depending on where you are in the country. This is for Cameroon. If you're in the urban areas, you consume a lot of wheat flour, not so much in other areas. This is the target. In 2012, data suggested that we were meeting about 76% of that target. When we went back in 2016, we found that it was about 30%. Now, what to do? You can ignore the evidence, you can shut down the program, or you can invest in strengthening the program. And based on the kinds of tools and data that we were able to bring to the table and the policy engagement process that we established in the context of Cameroon, the answer to the question was this, is that now they are investing in strengthening this program. And if you can slide back to 30, then you can make investments to get you back up to the target level. You just have to have the political will and the cash to actually make that happen. A few parting thoughts. Number one, interdisciplinary approaches are really required, both in setting standards and in making sure that these standards are adhered to. And with interdisciplinarity comes compromise, always. Second is that we are learning to drive, or we need to learn to drive with less than 20/20 vision. We will never have the perfect or complete data. We're never going to have the perfect analytical tools, but we are rarely blind. We always know something about the problems that we're dealing with. And we continue to develop the tools for using the data that exists and to invest in data collection as well. And the aim is to move from kind of evidence-influenced rather than evidence-based decision-making, and find these tipping points where moving ahead versus collecting more data is merited. And then remembering that you have to continue to do both. You have to monitor and evaluate these. My final point is, Seth is really the champion on this panel in the sense that the fundamental roles of in-country collaboration and policy engagement cannot be overlooked. In-country collaboration, you will never get the science right if you don't have Seth on your team or somebody like Seth. And it is impossible to effectively deliver evidence into policy arenas without your in-country policy engagement. And it really is the long-term presence and persistence that are needed and they need to be supported to get all these things done. I will end with that, Jerry, and turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Of course, a topic near and dear to my heart as an economist. Often we think about these cost considerations and the trade-offs among, various policy options after the fact. And as you point out, these things need to be thought about in parallel. And the people who control the resources and have to make those very difficult resource allocation decisions need to be involved in the conversation as early as possible. So I really applaud all of the presenters for adhering closely to our time limits. We've encroached just the tiniest bit on our discussion time. What I would like to do is sort of have as free-flowing and open a discussion as possible. But I'll take prerogative as chair and air traffic controller here to start with a question of my own. And I'm going to pose this to each and all of the panelists. Maybe you can each take a minute or two to think about your response in the context of my in the context of your work. And as I observe this, I see that really to be effective, not just in implementing, but in achieving uptake and scaling of various changes and interventions, that at the heart, there's the problem of behavior change. And it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about households changing behavior or communities changing behavior, or decision makers, policymakers changing behavior, or indeed private sector actors like people in the food industry changing their behavior. And so there are a lot of different points of entry, but at each of those, we're asking somebody to change his or her ways of working. And so as you reflect on your work, I'm wondering, do you have any evidence on whose behavior needs to change, how it needs to change, and what kinds of incentives or nudges are required to get that change? And of course, this puts aside some of the cost consideration issues, perhaps, but the point is, how do we get the people who need to change their behavior to change? So maybe we can take it in the order that we had the presentations, if you'd like. Maybe starting with Rob.
Oops.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jerry. Well, putting my AID hat on, I think the places where I think we can be particularly helpful would be picking up on Steve's point at the national level, where we have missions that collaborate with the host country government, but often with the private sector, and of course with other development investors, World Bank, UK aid, FCDO, all of them. And it seems to me that what we need here is an alliance of some sort between government and possibly expressed through policy and with the private sector to achieve both two things, really, scale and affordability and penetration, but also quality. The work that Will Masters and some others at Tufts, when they went to Malawi and looked at the relatively inexpensive complementary foods for, as children start to diversify their diet after 6 months, and the quality of the fortificants, where the fortification was all over the map, and the aflatoxin levels were all over the map, including some very high ones. So the behavior change that you referred to, I think industry certainly has a big role to play. We know that markets in a lot of the countries where we work and where we are most challenged with micronutrient deficiencies, we don't have the kinds of quality control in place. We don't have the testing and all the regulatory standards we're used to. But I think this is going to be an incremental process, I think, in terms of improving that. And it's one where the private and public sectors, with support and engagement, and I don't just mean funding, but I mean, prioritization by investors like USAID in diet quality and diet affordability, and including these targeted efforts. And then I guess the other thing that would be the big challenge, I think, we have such compelling evidence about the lipid supplements in terms of their efficacy, but the scalability has really been a challenge. And what would it take to get that, and how might we do it? The bouillon cube example is just brilliant, because the poorest people manage to get those in most cases. But how might we get that more targeted? With the lipid supplement, we're sort of sub-targeting within micronutrient deficient people. So that one, I think we need innovation, we need creative thinking, but again, the public and private sectors working together can engage on this and hopefully succeed. You're muted, Jerry.
So there, somebody's unmuted me. Magic. Thank you. I want to pull Christine in now, but I want to kind of riff a little bit on what Rob just suggested. And in thinking in particular about LNS, during your presentation, I was thinking, gee, getting every mother to open one of these packets and give it to their kid, that's behavior change on a really wide scale. And I was thinking, well, maybe you could integrate this into a school feeding program, where instead of changing the behavior of every mother, you just have to change the behavior of every school, which may be more manageable. But you're the one with the answer, so I want to hear from you.
If I can unmute myself. Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. Just maybe a point of clarification, though, is the lipid-based nutrient supplements that I was discussing today have been specially formulated for 6 to 24-month-old children. So for a school delivery platform, we'd be thinking about a different formulation of a product or a different type of product. But I do think that your point about household level behavior change versus some kind of systems level change is something worth considering, potentially in places where there are early child development kinds of programs or early child care settings, early child care types of settings. So that's maybe that is maybe an avenue to consider in the future. But I think that there's, to come back to your original question about behavior change, I think there's a few different actors, as it were. There's the child and the caregiver. And we do have very good evidence from the randomized trials that consumption and uptake or adherence is pretty good at that level. Mothers are willing to feed their children the LNS, and they do it with a high frequency. There are some challenges with respect to intra-household sharing. So for an intervention that's designed to be targeted to a particular individual, if it's being shared with other family members, then you're diluting the potential effect on the target individual person. So that's a challenge that needs to be worked through. But then there's that step outside the household of how the caregiver obtains the products, where they come from. Does the caregiver have to go to a place to pick them up? Is it delivered through the health facilities or healthcare setting? Or is it delivered through markets or some other mechanism? In terms of the studies that have had a central distribution mechanism, mothers do go to that place to pick up the supplements. So there's motivation to do that. And some, although limited evidence that in fact the LNS may serve as a nudge for obtaining other healthcare services. I'd like to see more studies on that to see whether it is in fact operating that way in multiple settings, but I think that it potentially could serve as a nudge to maybe go to growth monitoring or sessions or other obtain other services. But then at a higher level, there's the programmatic decision makers, the program implementers. And as Rob mentioned, I think the implementation challenges are important considerations. So I think from the household and caregiver level, there would be motivation to change behavior and probably good adherence and uptake. From the program perspective, I think there are difficulties. You know, when we look at iron folic acid supplements for pregnant women, this is something that we've known about for decades as being an effective intervention. But yet, are the supplements in the health facilities? No, because we have distribution challenges and logistics challenges. So I think solving those kinds of problems, the programmatic challenges will be the bigger hurdle than the individual household behavior change for this intervention.
Great, thanks. I'm really fascinated by this idea that, you know, the intervention could crowd in other virtuous behavior and create positive spillovers. And I'll be interested to see how Steve was going to be able to fit that into his optimization model. But you know, that's a really encouraging sign. You know, maybe we'll switch over to Reina to talk a little bit about Bouillon, where the behavior change is not at the household level, because we know lots of households are using this, but maybe more at the industry level, getting industry to kind of buy into this. As we transition to Reina, I'd also like to encourage everyone who's joined us, the non-panelists, to turn on your videos, and we'll try to pull you into the conversation as well, because this is supposed to be a broader discussion and you may have some questions. So Reina?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. I think thinking about behavior change and fortification, because I think it's easy to think that, oh, you just stick the vitamin A in the oil and you're done. But you're right, somebody has to do something differently. So I think maybe one key distinction in terms of the type of behavior change and by whom is whether the program is mandatory or voluntary. And in the case of a mandatory program, then it's a smaller, maybe subset of program implementers with the industry and maybe the government bodies that are tasked with doing the monitoring that require behavior change. And then, so it's maybe a smaller number of individuals, but they also face some unique institutional constraints also. And so I think there's been a lot of work on understanding how best to support programs once they're up and running, and making sure that responsibilities are clear, that everyone has the resources that they need, and things like premix waivers for the industries. And I know a number of, at least at the beginning, some large scale programs have also done kind of mass communication activities. But from what I've seen in terms of the surveys that happen afterward, after some time, it seems like within the public, there's not always a lot of recognition that these are happening. So that's sort of the beauty of mandatory fortification, is that it can still be impactful. And I think with the voluntary fortification, it's a very different question in terms of what products are on the market and how many companies decide to fortify and with how much, and then who's accessing each of those products. And is it the people who are at risk for deficiency or the people who have more purchasing power? And so then I think it's a more complex set of issues around what's driving people's purchasing decisions and what are the incentives for the industry to fortify, and then for individuals to choose those fortified products versus the non-fortified. Some thoughts there. Welcome others from other people.
Yeah, great. Seth, maybe you could talk about the nudges and incentives necessary to change the behavior on the part of Ghanaian policymakers and/or private sector players? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of the behavior change has to come from the government sectors, the specific sectors that either support some of these programs or they are supposed to endorse some of these programs. In the past, the general idea is that the locally available fruits and vegetables and staples are enough to address the micronutrient problems. People at the ministries, they seem to be hesitant or not exactly receptive to nutrient supplementation or fortification, concerns about maybe sustainability and cost and things like that. It is changing, but the general idea that they don't like to accept or they don't, if they don't change, if they don't change enough to either support or endorse some of these programs, then it's difficult to move forward. Yes, I understand that dietary modification, those are key, those are the most desirable, but nutrient supplementation, fortification, they all also have their place. And I think we have to find a way to communicate with them, let them understand the need to engage, to accept, and to promote some of these interventions. And that is where we need a bit of behavior change.
Great. And Stephen, I'll let you have the last word on this, perhaps.
Okay. Just a couple of thoughts. One is, as everybody has suggested, there's a whole, it's not a single behavioral change, but usually a sequence of behavioral changes that are required. And that makes it hard because you can change 7 of the 8 links. If you don't get the 8th link, then you fail. And one key example of that in the context of the bouillon cube is the industry folks, they need to change their behavior. They need to formulate these, they need to fortify these bouillon cubes, and they're willing to do it if they can get a level playing field in terms of commercial activities. And that's a really hard thing to do. There's at least 40 bouillon products that are being produced and distributed in Nigeria right now. And roughly half of them actually come from outside the country. And so all of a sudden you have a new person that has to, or new group that has to be convinced, and it's the Ministry of Trade, is that they have to pay attention to bouillon products crossing the border. And they're scratching their head saying, what? Bouillon cubes? You want me to test bouillon cubes now? And so we have to bring them on board. They have to see the usefulness of this and commit to actually doing it. So it's a whole sequence of links that have behaviors that have to change. Some of them are completely new to folks, in nutrition discussions. The other thing is the language has to be right. In Ethiopia, for example, they have been trying for over a decade to get the mandatory fortification of imported oils, which is 95% of all the edible oils that are consumed are imported from Malaysia, with vitamin A and vitamin D. And they've been trying, using nutrition arguments. And even we were involved in demonstrating, how many individuals would be effectively covered. And we weren't getting traction. And so we had to change the language and to convert. We worked with the Johns Hopkins team to convert, using the list tool, convert effective coverage into lives saved. And all of a sudden, we had something that policymakers could get their teeth into. It says, oh, we could save lives by fortifying oil. Well, why didn't you tell us that before? Well, we kind of did, but well, no, you didn't. Okay. And once that was clear, then in fact, they made really quick progress on actually getting 95% of all the oil consumed in Ethiopia fortified with vitamin A and vitamin D. And so it was part behavioral change, but it was a part of change in kind of language that actually allowed us to do it.
Excellent. Excellent. Maybe the behavior changes on the part of the researcher and the participants in the program. I'm now going to invite some questions and comments. And when you switch on your microphone, I'll try to call out the individual, but please introduce yourself and where you're from so that we all have that knowledge. So Catherine Dewey, I believe you have a comment you want to add to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jerry. Yeah, I'm Kay Dewey. I'm part of the UC Davis team and a member of the Institute for Global Nutrition going way back before it was called that. And I have a couple of general comments. The presentations were great. I know that this dialogue is intended in part to feed into the Food Systems Summit and the Nutrition for Growth Summit. And one of the things that I think is important is to discuss the idea of making the concept of food fortification broader than what most people think about. Right now, home fortification is really not mentioned as a part of food fortification. So things like micronutrient powders and small quantity LNS are pretty much left out of the conversation around food fortification. And that has some important consequences because, as was explained, you can't really target children under 2 very well, especially for things like iron when you're dealing with large-scale food fortification. So I wanted to toss that out there as a sort of conceptual issue. And another thing I want to mention is that at UC Davis, one of the highlights, I think, of our approaches over the years has been working with policymakers and stakeholders from the very beginning of the conceptualization of the research that we do. So we are problem focused and we do research so that we can aim at those problems and we get input from stakeholders and from our collaborating institutions in the countries we work in from the very beginning. And this has really paid off. So for example, we were involved in writing documents for the World Health Organization on guidelines for complementary feeding of children under 2 20 years ago. And that now is has been taken into scaling up in terms of messaging around the world. And the work we're doing now on small quantity LNS is likewise feeding into what will be revised guidance around feeding of infants and young children. And we're engaged in that as well. So it's a two-way street. And I just think that's an important model to emphasize. And then lastly, one more comment about positioning. I haven't heard very much conversation around making the case that food fortification, including home fortification, has important implications for affordability of nutritiously, of diets that are nutritionally adequate. And this has important equity issues. So when we talk about how do you construct a diet that is nutritious, if you don't use fortified products at all, it's very expensive. So fortification is a tool to make equity issues more upfront. And in addition, planetary health issues as well, because for some of the nutrients like iron and zinc and calcium, which predominantly come from animal source foods, fortification is a way to reduce reliance on those for meeting nutrient needs. So for the Food Systems Summit, these are all issues that I hope will be raised. Thanks.
Thanks, Kay. And thank you for bringing in those topics of both equity and climate, which obviously need to be central to the broader discussion. And the more that we connect to those issues, the greater constituency we'll be able to build for the nutrition interventions. Would anyone from the panel like to comment or react to Catherine? And I'm looking in the chat. Rob will, and while he's speaking, I'm going to kind of scan and see if there are any hands or comments in the chat, others who would like to jump in. Rob?
Yeah, no, thanks. Those are really good points, Kay. And I do have some reactions the affordability, absolutely. And that's what I meant when I meant safety nets, because these are the foods that are affordable and people, poor people do eat. So that's, I think that's absolutely at the heart of this strategy. You know, in the developing context where USAID works, I would be, you know, what I mentioned also, and totally agree with that point about the fact that a quality diet, as we know, the Eat Lancet diet is out of reach for about 3 billion people, right? And that's a diet that's heavy, you know, light in source foods and heavier in other foods, and even there, it's still too expensive. So I'm less keen to while at a global scale, one might make the argument about animal source foods. We're working so hard in the context where we work to actually make animal source foods more available because people just don't get enough of them. So that one I'm a little, you know, it's a little more tricky and kind of context specific, I'd say. The final one is, you know, the home fortification. It's a really interesting idea. It's been around a long time. And I don't know why. I mean, maybe that's a behavior change question, but maybe some question there is, why hasn't it taken off more? But I also would just add to the fact that for the complementary foods, you know, those fortified infant cereals, many people, even poorer people, are purchasing those now. So, you know, I think we need all these things. None of them are silver bullets. And they're all complementary. They're all arrows in our quiver. But you know, for all of us in a development agency like AID, it's trying to figure out, you know, what are the best options that we ought to be trying to work with the research community to and the food system to validate and scale. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. So I saw 3 hands go up. Unfortunately, I didn't see in what order they went up. So I'm going to ask Elodie first, whether it's a question or a comment, followed by Kendra, then followed by Christine.
Hi, I am Elodie Beke, and I'm working for IFPRI, and I'm based in the regional office in Dakar. So I'll just have tiny comments, maybe really specific to West Africa where I work, and it will be all over the place because it's comments coming from everywhere. But first, I maybe didn't hear one point of entry, which is the regional level, and for fortification, I know that a lot of work has been conducted with the West African Health Organization, and some regulatory work as well has been conducted on that, and that was a point of entry to have the countries come to regulate food fortification. So that is something that that is actually continuing, and I know that the NGOs involved in food fortification are working with West African Health Organization and other regional bodies. Another thing which has nothing to do with that, but I really appreciated when you said that the language has to be right, because what is true is that when it comes to those 2 products, Bouillon Cube or SQLNS, you have kind of schizophrenic point of views. First, in West Africa, people are really like to promote local products, and those fortified products, they are most often imported products. So you have to position it well to show that maybe it's possible to fortify local product, or that it's complementary. Or, for example, in the case of bouillon, everyone is consuming it, even though it's imported. So maybe you have actually to hide it. But they, like the policymakers or even the NGOs, they are afraid that by giving the opportunity to the private sector to promote their product because it's fortified, you will have actually a reverse impact, which is that those products which are fortified, and this is the second point, they are very often of very poor nutritional quality. It's what you fortified is salt, fat, sugar. Like this is exactly what is leading to non-communicable diseases. And so this is like, you have to be careful not to sign a blank check for promotion for these products because they are fortified and you say they are good nutritionally. And this is, I know that I've talked to a lot of policymakers and this is something that they really push back because of that. And just to finish, the questions that the implementers, the NGOs, so I work with SQLNS and we have started a discussion at the regional level with all implementers involved in nutrition about SQLNS and other products used for supplementation of young children. And the three, or I would say two main questions are what the cost, who is incurred the cost, and we are still missing evidence on that, or who should be incurred the cost. And we need more evidence about what are the main implementation challenges and how to overcome them. So this is it.
Thanks, Elodie, for joining us and for those insightful comments that really complement the presentations and add to the discussion. I want to ask Kendra and encourage everyone. There are several individuals on deck, and so we have about 15 minutes remaining. If you can keep your comments and questions short, then that will allow more participation. So I encourage you to move ahead. Kendra?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kendra Bird. I'm a nutrition scientist with World Fish, which might give you a little clue as to the nature of my comments. But so I thank you all for the presentations. They were very interesting. So I'm always thinking about things through the lens of fish and animal source foods. And Rob touched on it briefly a little bit about increasing access to animal source foods. And I think that is an important point. Often I think fish get sort of swept under the rug as another animal source food, and animal source foods are expensive, but fish, and especially small dried fish, are often affordable and families can buy them in smaller amounts. So I think it is important to take into account when we're talking about these large scale, scalable interventions that we consider fish and aquatic foods, not only in promoting them as part of a healthy diet since they're often accessible, but in perhaps using them as a home fortificant as well, that can be locally available. So recently, my colleagues and I published a paper looking at dried fish powder and compared it to LNS and nutrient concentration wise, and it compared fairly favorably. Obviously, LNS is specially formulated and has a suite of nutrients, but I think it's nice to think about these other solutions, especially of availability of nutrient-dense foods that are locally available. And especially, as Kay pointed out, when we're thinking about planetary health, sometimes the production of these foods can be increased in a environmentally friendly way and have a little friendlier impact on the environment. And there was one study done in Bangladesh looking at a promotion program promoting mola. It's a small fish that can be consumed whole. It's very rich in vitamin A. And they did find that that was cost effective compared to a wheat flour fortification program. So just throwing it out there that fish and aquatic foods do play an important role here, even when we're talking about large scale interventions.
Thanks, Kendra. I'm going to tap Christine because I know she wants to react to maybe some earlier comments. And Mark, you're on deck.
Yeah, just briefly to reflect on the sustainability issue that Kay raised a moment ago. and that Kendra just reflected on. I would just like to argue that, the ultimate goal is a healthy, diverse diet that's accessible to all, and that would include a mix of fruits and vegetables and animal source foods. And from the sustainability perspective, I think that we should be, working on the production and environmental sustainability side to work with producers and farmers to be able to produce the products more efficiently. And I think that there's a lot of research and exciting work that's being done to do that. So I wouldn't say that that food fortification or SQLNS is a way to replace animal source foods, but it's an interim solution to solve a problem, to meet micronutrient requirements now in the context of an unaffordable, diverse food system that has current problems with sustainability. But I think that in parallel, we should be working to try to solve those other problems, the production and sustainability in parallel. So I just wanted to make that comment. I think Kendra also raised it too with respect to fish, but I think it goes beyond fish as well.
Great. And Mark?
Yeah,
Followed by
I think it's time for something like Sprinkles Plus. As Steve points out, when there's a chain and there's a weak link in the chain, then that's ultimately how well the chain works. I'm not opposed necessarily, but food fortification staple food fortification with different micronutrients is basically singling something out, and we don't see enough impact of that. I think we're going to see pretty soon countries going away from that, like India and vitamin A. So I'm not particularly so enthusiastic about that. But when I mean plus what, I believe there's a lot of things we don't know, and we can list out 100 nutrients, and there's probably 200 more that are bioactive and doing something very good. And the clue to me about that is about animal source foods, and in particular milk, because what do mammals make to make their kids grow? Milk. So that, whatever, we may not have to know exactly everything that's in milk, but in some way, including milk products is a way to go. And there's new encapsulation techniques. There was a pretty exciting paper, which now is not new, 2 years ago in Science about that I think we can take advantage of ways to add these to foods. But I don't see, I see that's where I'm putting my bet on the home feeding all the residents in the home the best.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And I don't want to turn off the discussion, which is very rich and useful, but we do have to reserve a little bit of time at the end for Ermias, who wants to discuss next steps. So Lynn, and following Lynn, Mudzuzi, sorry that I had difficulty with your name. And that will probably end our comment and discussion period.
Thank you. And it's great to be here. And I wanted, in a sense, to follow up on something that Elodie was saying, and which I thought we hadn't really considered, because we all know the population that we care about and who we think fortification is appropriate to. But the Food Systems Summit in particular is global. And I was actually involved in the negotiations at the Committee on World Food Security of the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. And that was all out war on fortification, to be frank. At one stage, it looked like it wouldn't get in at all. And it did get in the end, with one reference, which actually reads, food fortification should be evidence and science-based and could be part of nutrition-specific actions where necessary in specific context to address micronutrient gaps of public health concern in line with national legislation. Now, any of you that have done negotiations know that was about countries making sure it was as vague, as non-specific, and as non-actionable as possible. And I think what's going on is, you can tell from my accent, even though I've lived here 30 years, I'm a true Brit and I go home regularly. And there's a real bifurcation in food systems. I mean, I'm on the mailing lists of supermarkets in the UK who send me the advert each week saying what's on sale. And it might say, this is rich in potassium, or this is rich in calcium. Now, I'm also on the mailing lists of American supermarkets who tell me nothing about that. They tell me how many I can get free when I buy something, and it's got no health and no nutrition. So what you're seeing in Europe is a big focus on nutrition and a big focus on it coming from diets and a big move against industry. You know, when I use the cereal box, you know, the front of the cereal box is beautiful for kids. It gets them to want to buy it on a supermarket shelf. Their parents look at the front and it says fortified with this, fortified with that, fortified with something else. So the parent thinks it's good. They don't turn over the back and say, oh, it's got 4 teaspoons of sugar added to it. So there's a huge concern in Europe about the industry using fortification and front pack labeling to actually skew people towards ultra-processed, unhealthy foods. And that, I think, you know, in the debate at the CFS, whilst Europe may have led that, there were a lot of developing low-income countries who were also concerned about setting up their food system to go that way. So I think, you know, the debate, we have to be much more nuanced and careful about how we're doing that these days.
Thank you very much for that perspective, which I think is a necessary one, and somewhat, I guess, sobering would be the word for us who are thinking about the private sector and how the private sector can be involved. So thank you. Last comment comes from our colleague Zuzi, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ermias for closing comments.
Thank you, Gerald, and thank you to the panelists for interesting presentations. I have 2 general comments. I'll be quick with the first, especially. Just to add to Christine's points, I was going to suggest adding an explicit mention of the need for implementation research in addition to effectiveness studies, especially research that would account for product quality, delivery systems, combinations with other interventions, and focus on a range of intervention or implementation outcomes as a suggestion for additional evidence that's needed. My second comment pertained to thinking about fortification more broadly, and some of the questions that we've been having. That there's a question that's not often systematically addressed, one of multiple fortification in terms of co-fortification with of a single vehicle with multiple nutrients, or in some instances, the use of a mandated vehicle as an ingredient to another food that ends up being fortified. I think the Minimod tool is a way that can help us disentangle some of those issues. But I wondered to what extent this is being factored into some of the Bullion work, because it poses sort of an implementation question, but also a policy question in terms of how we enforce fortification or standards, set standards and regulate them in the context of those those levels of co-fortification. Yeah, I'll stop there in the interest of time. That was the thrust of the comment. Thanks.
Thank you. The excellent contribution to the conversation and adding points that were not previously made. So thank you for that. You know, the litmus test for these kinds of events is, you know, whether we've learned things. And I've learned a tremendous amount in the last 2 hours. I really applaud all of the presenters and the participants. Thank you for the thoughtful and constructive presentations, the high quality and of the discussion. I'll now turn it over to Ermias, who has some final comments.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was very nicely facilitated, and thank you everybody for joining us today. The discussion that we've had today will be summarized and submitted to the Food Systems Summit in the next 2 weeks. And in the next few days, we will be sending you a draft of this report for you to review as well. And hopefully you will get your edits within about a week or so after we send it to you, so that we can include it in the final draft. And as I said earlier this morning, the recording of today's dialogue will be available in a few weeks on the UC Davis World Food Center website. So again, I'd like to thank USDA and particularly USDA Foreign Agricultural Service for the support to put this all together. This is the second of the series of independent dialogues that we're hosting. There's a few more to come on different topics. So hopefully we'll get involved in the other topics as well. So thank you again for spending your time and sharing your knowledge with us. Have a good day and have a good evening.